Good evening. I'm Ian Wardropper, Director of the Frick Collection. I'm pleased to welcome you all tonight to the first lecture in a series in connection with the exhibition Van Dyck, The Anatomy of Portraiture, which opened to the public today and which continues through June 5th. The exhibition will remain open for half an hour after this lecture, and I feel certain that what you hear tonight will make you want to go and look at some of the drawings and prints and paintings for yourself afterward. Shortly after I began at the Frick 4.5 years ago, Stijn Alsteens ran into me, whether by design or by chance, in a reception at another museum and proposed an exhibition on Van Dyck portraits. I had known and admired Stijn when I was at the Met, and he was a curator of the Department of Prints and Drawings and Prints. Sorry, that's a very important distinction. It was also an irresistible topic, given that he is one of the preeminent experts on Northern European drawings, and the Frick holds 8 important paintings by the artist. We also had the good fortune of having Adam Aker as a Poulet Fellow here to work on the show for more than 2 years, and then he stayed on as a guest curator, and I'm glad to announce that he's going to be beginning as curator of Dutch and Flemish painting at the Metropolitan Museum next week. He, by the way, is going to be lecturing as part of this series, and it is on April 13th, and I hope you might pick up a brochure that's been produced for the exhibition, which lists a rich range of lectures, symposia, seminars, and other related events. Finally, Xavier Salomon, who's the Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator and joined us about 2 years ago, himself had worked on a Van Dyck exhibition when he was at the Dulwich Picture Gallery in London, Van Dyck in Sicily. So with this team in place, their focus became to comprehensively examine the artist's use of preparatory media in the creation of his portraits, from drawings and oil sketches to the paintings and the etchings and engravings that he made himself or commissioned after them for a project that was called the iconography. With 102 objects, it's the largest show that we've mounted at the Frick, but the curators persuaded me that this was the scale necessary to do justice to the theme of the show, and with the importance of our holdings on Van Dyck, this was an artist indeed to celebrate at the Frick. While Stijn had critical support from the other curators, he was the driving force behind the exhibition, and his background prepared him well for this project. His nationality is Belgian, his mother tongue is Dutch, but like some of his compatriots, he is seriously multilingual, speaking French, English, German, and Russian with, as he puts it, passive command of Italian, Polish, Latin, and Old Church Slavonic. He studied Slavic literature and languages in Leuven and then at the University of Amsterdam and St. Petersburg State University, followed by the pursuit of art history at the University of Amsterdam, completing his doctorate cum laude in 2005. He was a curator briefly at the Fritz Lucht collection in Paris in 2006. Some of you may remember exhibitions that we've mounted from that institution here, and indeed they've lent to the current exhibition. He started work as a curator in the Department of Prints and Drawings, did it again, Drawings and Prints at the Met, in late 2006, where he continues to today. His extensive publications have centered on Northern or Central European drawings, prints, and art, and in this field he has curated and contributed to exhibitions such as Mélange Russe, Russian Drawings, Prints, and Letters in the Lucht collection of 2005, Man, Myth, and Sensual Pleasures, Jan Gossart's Renaissance of 2010, Grand Design, Peter Kocher van Elst and Renaissance Tapestry, a wonderful exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum in 2014 featuring his drawings, paintings, as well as tapestries, and Pleasure and Piety, the Art of Joachim Oeteweil of 2015, an exhibition which you might have seen at the National Gallery of Art in Washington or in Houston. When I was at the Metropolitan Museum, there was rarely an acquisitions meeting at which Stijn did not present a major drawing or two, and he led a concerted effort of his department to build up its holdings in Northern European drawings, which resulted in the exhibition and catalog Dürer and Beyond, Central European Drawings in the Metropolitan Museum, 1400 to 1700, which took place in 2012. I'm grateful to the Metropolitan Museum for lending him to us for the show, and I look forward to hearing his lecture, Drawing for Portraits. This also will be streamed live and available later on our website, and I want to remind you again that the exhibition will be open for you to visit for half an hour after the lecture. Thank you. Please welcome Stijn Alsteens.
Thank you, Ian, not only for the kind introduction, but also, I would say, above all, for your support for this exhibition from its very beginning. It has been a privilege and a true pleasure to work on this show with you, with your two successive chief curators, Colin Bailey and Xavier Salomon, and with the rest of the outstanding staff here at the Frick. And I hope, the show is one everyone at the Frick can be proud of. I know I am. Thank you. Those of you who have seen the exhibition will have noticed that it shifts the usual balance between preparatory works and finished works, between drawings and oil sketches on the one hand, and prints and paintings on the other, in favor of the former. Today, anyone with a camera or a cell phone can make a portrait with more or less success. Here are two curators in the process of being photographed by a professional, Bill Cunningham, who is in the process himself of being photographed by the owner of an iPhone. Thank you, Heidi. And also today, portraits can look like these of an owner and a former owner of an important collection of works by Van Dyck, both by Lucian Freud. Or they can look like this self-portrait by Louise Bourgeois, or they can even look like this, two more portraits by Bourgeois, of which the sitter at left is identified with the initial CY. I don't know if that's a man or a woman, while the one at your right is called Jean-Louis. In the centuries preceding the 20th, however, a portrait was supposed to offer a more precise idea of what the face of a sitter looked like. In 1708, the French art critic Roger de Pile wrote that the greatest perfection of a portrait is extreme likeness. Making a drawing with the artist sitting in front of the model was certainly the most efficient way to capture that likeness, as it required little more than a sheet of paper, a pen and some ink, or a piece of chalk. Such drawings could be admired as works of art in their own right, or they could serve as the basis for other portraits, such as a painting or a print. Possibly the earliest preserved example of such drawings by well-known artists are those executed in the early and mid-15th century in the delicate medium of metal point. This small sheet by the Frenchman Jean Fouquet is one of the great masterpieces at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and depicts, as the painter noted himself in the inscription at upper right, a Roman legate of the Holy See in France. It dates from around 1461. Even earlier is Jan van Eyck's famous drawing in Dresden, also of a clergyman, traditionally identified as the Italian Cardinal Niccolò Albergati, and dated around 1431. Van Eyck's drawing, as is well known, is exceptional not only for its quality, but also because it must be the earliest example of a drawing that served as the basis of a painted portrait, the panel in Vienna, the famous panel in Vienna at your right, in the Kunsthistorisches Museum. It is worth looking more closely at Van Eyck's and Fouquet's drawings, as in this slide, and marvel at their astounding meticulousness, often complemented by handwritten notes, as in the extensive ones by Van Eyck on the color of the hair, the eyes, the skin, and the lips of the cardinal. Very few other portrait drawings by the great 15th century Northern masters exist, but it is clear from paintings, such as this one by Hans Memling, that they too must have made detailed studies on paper, probably also in metal points. Even in the face of a relatively young man like the Florentine banker Tommaso Portinari, depicted here at the age of about 40, Memling seems to have described every wrinkle, every hair in the stubble, every subtle inclination in the structure of the face, and even what I suppose is a scar on the chin caused by a shaving accident. Looking at the original portraits by painters like Memling, the one I'm showing in the galleries of the Metropolitan, for instance, or the very similar panel in the Frick's collection just a few rooms from here, will make you realize that no painters before or after the 15th century attempted such levels of verisimilitude. Assuming this amount of detail truly corresponded to reality, drawn head studies like the surviving ones by Van Eyck and Fouquet played a major part in the genesis of these portraits. In Italy, too, detailed portrait drawings were produced. Among the earliest, with a secure attribution, is this sheet by Fra Angelico in the Royal Collection in Windsor Castle, dated only slightly later than Van Eyck's. This drawing by Filippino Lippi at Chatsworth dates from the last years of the 15th century, and like that by Fra Angelico, it was made with metal points on colored paper and heightened with white gouache, a favorite technique of 15th century Italian draftsmen. A particularly attractive aspect of these drawings and of portrait drawings in general is their informality. An informality artists could very rarely get away with in painted portraits, in which a certain decorousness had to be respected, as evidence, for instance, in this picture by Lippi in the Mellon collection in Washington, a portrait of an unidentified youth. By the time Lippi made his drawing, the use of metal points seems to have been largely abandoned, however, and replaced by a preference for chalks. Pisanello already used black chalks for portraits in the middle of the 15th century, such as these in the most important collection of his drawings, the Louvre. By the way, notice again the remarkable informality of the drawing at your right, not a man posing, but one quietly observed by the artist. Another artist from Verona, Francesco Bonsignori, used black chalk in a drawing at the Albertina in Vienna in preparation of a painting dated 1487 at the National Gallery in London. A small group of drawings in black chalk are, if I can trust my Italian colleagues, considered the work of Andrea Mantegna, here at left one in Besançon, and at right a drawing in Berlin by Luca Signorelli. Both date from the last decade of the 15th century. And around 1500, Leonardo da Vinci made this celebrated profile portrait of Isabella d'Este, also at the Louvre, which records one of the first uses of colored chalk, colored fabricated chalks, or pastel. The advantages of chalk must have been immediately obvious to portrait draftsmen. In the words of an esteemed colleague, these advantages are the greater tonal range of this medium and its capacity for quick erasure and correction in drawing a figure from life. Chalks and charcoal and graphite pencil from the late 18th century on would become the favorite drawing material for most portraitists, not only in Italy, but also in France and in Northern Europe. In the oeuvre of the greatest 16th century German artist, Albrecht Dürer, drawings in metal points, such as this delicate sheet from a sketchbook still occur. The drawing was made in 1520 in Antwerp during his trip to the Netherlands. At the same time, however, actually on the same trip, Dürer made a series of larger, independent portrait drawings in charcoal, here one at the British Museum, convincingly identified as a portrait of the Danish king Christian II. Although for few Netherlandish artists, or rather northern artists, portrait drawings have been preserved and conclusions can only be reached with due caution, the majority of those that do survive are done in chalk or charcoal. The Dutchman Lucas van Leyden made this drawing, now in Leyden, relying a bit more than Dürer on hatching for modeling, and we see Lucas's training as an engraver in here, but also very possibly directly inspired by the model of the German, who Lucas met in Antwerp in 1521. Northern artists of the early and mid-16th century used black chalk often in combination with red, which is, of course, very well suited to the rendering of flesh tones. The drawing at right here is part of the large group of drawings by Jean Clouet in Chantilly and dates from around the same time as the drawings by Dürer and Lucas, while the one at left, which is from the Getty's collection and dates from the 1530s, is by another great portraitist by whom a large number of portrait drawings survive, of course, Hans Holbein the Younger. Note, by the way, that Holbein's drawing also includes relatively extensive penwork in those areas, especially the hair, where graphic clarity was more important to him than tonal range. By the early decades of the 16th century, the combined use of black and red chalk must have been introduced in the Netherlands. Of the greatest portraitist of the time, Jan Gossart, on whom, as Ian said, the Metropolitan organized an exhibition a few years ago, we have a record of a study of a man dated 1528 and, I'm quoting, marvelously drawn from life in black and red chalk, end of quote. It is probable that Gossard made drawings of this type, as refined as those by Clouet and Holbein, for all of his paintings, which, as you can judge from this detail of a triptych at the Louvre, continue the tradition of meticulousness of Jan van Eyck and other early Netherlandish painters. Possibly the earliest preserved Netherlandish head study in black and red chalk is this work in Berlin by the competent and sought-after portraitist Willem Key. The Latin inscription at upper left specifically stresses that the drawing was made in black and red chalk. Although not as refined as any of the drawings we have seen before, it does describe the sitter's face in sufficient detail for Key to base a portrait on, which indeed exists in Antwerp. The tradition of drawing portraits from life in black or red chalk, or a combination of both, can be neatly followed in all of Europe. Federico Zuccaro combined the two in several smaller drawings, including this portrait of the Flemish sculptor Jan Bologna, dating from around 1575. And 15 years later, the Haarlem engraver Hendrik Holtzius, traveling in Italy, depicted the same sitter in a drawing at the Teylers Museum in Haarlem, here at right, in a similar technique than Zuccaro's, but on a much larger scale and with northern directness and realism, I would say. Peter Paul Rubens, here, refined the technique, adding white chalks for highlights, and in a series of mostly independent portrait studies, many of relatives or friends produced some of the masterpieces in the genre, such as the superb portrait seen here of his first wife, Isabella Brandt, at the British Museum, to which I will come back later. I cannot resist giving a quick overview of other portrait drawings in the same technique with more or less randomly chosen examples recently acquired by my institution. Forgive me the indulgence. In the 1620s, the Franco-Flemish artist Philippe de Champaigne here depicted his wife in a restrained combination of black and white chalks. In a much richer technique, including pastel, Simon Vouet, the French artist, around the same time portrayed Louis XIII, possibly the most vivid and intimate likeness of the French king. In Holland, some decades later, an artist close to the great printmaker and draftsman Cornelis Visser drew this portrait in black chalk on vellum, probably as a finished work of art. And the artist, whoever he is, clearly dated the drawing, as you can see. Also Dutch, but smaller and even more informal, is this head of a man by the 18th century artist Cornelis Stroost, which seems to be made au trois crayons, that is with black, red, and white chalk. But the artist actually only used the former two, red and black chalk, and created the white highlight on the man's nose by leaving blank the white of the paper. The 18th century's fondness of the technique au trois crayons is better illustrated by this large drawing from 1741, one of only two known by the great sculptor Jean-Baptiste Lemoine the Younger, who here portrayed his pupil Étienne Maurice Falconet, by all accounts a man with a sharp sense of humor, as I think this drawing expresses, who became famous after he moved to Russia and worked for Catherine the Great, the Russian empress. Entirely done in red chalk is this portrait, a very adorable one, of a boy by the German Georg Friedrich Schmidt. And the Englishman Thomas Lawrence made and signed this highly finished independent portrait in black and red chalks in 1789, while a year or two later, Angelika Kaufmann captured the appearance and allure of the gorgeous Lady Hamilton when they were both in Naples in this large drawing. In this most recent acquisition of my department, one of Jacques-Louis David's star pupils, Pierre Narcisse Guérin, the artist evokes all the romantic fire of this young man with little more than black chalk and a technique called smudging. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, of course, is one of the greatest portraitists of all times and one of the most virtuoso handlers of graphite, or what is commonly called pencil, in the portrait drawings he made very much malgré lui of relatives, friends, colleagues, and English tourists in Rome. Here, a loving portrait of his wife, Madeleine. In an almost even more meticulous mode, the Austrian Ferdinand Georg Waldmüller used graphite to draw this honest, refined portrait of an elderly woman. And the great sculptor Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux, who was also an obsessive draftsman, produced one of his most impressive works on paper in this self-portrait from 1865, which was also on view in the Metz Carpeaux exhibition a year or two ago. I do not want to make the impression that only charcoal or graphite were used when artists drew a portrait from life. This unforgettable self-portrait in the Robert Lehman collection was sketched with pen and ink by the young Dürer, Francisco Goya, who could draw with the brush and ink like no one else before or after him, drew this self-portrait entirely in that technique. And from the last years of the 19th century dates this sheet, also a fascinating self-portrait, by the young Käthe Kollwitz, who built up her face in long lines drawn with pen. But despite these examples, I think it is accurate to say that by and large chalk and other mineral media were favored for drawing portraits from life, while pen and ink were more often turned to for highly finished effigies based on earlier sketches done from nature, such as this print-like portrait of an unknown artist by the 17th century Dutchman David Bailly. It is evident how, in the age before photography, head studies from life were essential to the traits of the portraitist. I showed you earlier tonight the drawings and related paintings by Jan van Eyck and Francesco Bonsignori. On the basis of sketches from life, painters, especially in Italy, also produced cartoons, drawings on the size of the finished picture, which played a role in the transfer of the sketch to the panel or the canvas, and which usually focus mainly on the image's outlines, as in this recently discovered cartoon in the Louvre, incised by Parmigianino when he was at work on his famous portrait in the National Gallery in London at Wright. Although a lot more could be learned about such full-size outline drawings, it is clear that their use was not restricted to Italy and not even to the Renaissance. Here are two other recent acquisitions of the Metropolitan Museum, a large drawing by Ingres for an apparently never executed painting, entirely different from the kind of independent drawings he made on commission, and at Wright, an even larger drawing by the Dane Peder Severin Krøyer, for which the painting and a related smaller oil sketch still survive. Moving from painting to sculpture, one of the drawings by Pisanello I brought up before, a portrait of Filippo Maria Visconti, served the artist for the medal at Wright on the screen, even if the scale of drawing and medal is completely different. Drawings for fully sculpted portraits are a separate, harder to fathom type, also because they appear to be very rare. One of the most important extant examples by one of the greatest sculptors of all times is this profile portrait of Scipione Borghese by Gian Lorenzo Bernini from about 1632, one of the major drawings in the collection of the Morgan Library. It is, of course, preparatory to his marble portrait of the Cardinal at the Villa Borghese in Rome, of which I'm showing you a detail of the first version here with the famous crack running through the forehead. When comparing the two works, one is struck by the much higher level of detail in the marble version, and it is clear that Bernini must have relied on much more than just a Morgan drawing to conceive and execute his bust. Look, for instance, at the wrinkles around the eyes of the Cardinal. A type of portrait drawing that I have not yet mentioned, but that is especially relevant in the context of the present exhibition, are models made for prints, of which the execution was usually entrusted by a designer, for instance a painter, to a professional woodcutter or engraver. I already mentioned that no portrait drawings in chalk survive by the outstanding Netherlandish portraitist Jan Gossart, even if at least one such drawing in black and red chalk is recorded. Gossart did leave us, however, this magnificent pen drawing in the Lucht collection at left, a portrait of the same Danish king, Christian II, who sat for Dürer in the chalk drawing that I showed you before and that is here again at Wright. But already the meticulousness of Gossart's drawn portrait, the fully resolved character of the sitter's pose, and the composition, as well as the complete lack of pentimenti, should make clear that this is not a work done from life. It must be based, rather, on a sadly lost study that was probably not unlike the one by Dürer, at least in size and technique. In fact, there is evidence in Gossart's pen drawing that he based Christian's head on a preceding study. The different color of ink, which you can see in his drawing, used for the head, indicates that he drew it in a different campaign from the clothes, the hands, and the ornate border, for which a skilled artist as he probably did not need to refer to preliminary studies. With some exaggeration, one could say that Gossart did not make the drawing at left as a portrait, but he made it as a prince model, which is reversed but meticulously followed in the anonymous engraving based on it here at Wright. It is now time to bring up the artist who is the subject of our exhibition and who, with some justification, can be called the greatest, most beloved, and most influential portraitist of all times. About 300 drawings by Anthony van Dyck survive, and a little over a third of these are studies related to portraits. About 60 are reunited at the Frick for this exhibition, and they give as complete an overview of his work as a portrait draftsman as is possible today. When conceiving the show and selecting the sheets to be included, we hoped, of course, that each one would hold its own as a work that Van Dyck may not have intended as independent, but that our modern eyes can enjoy just as much as his finished paintings and prints. But taken together and seen in the context of the old sketches, prints, and finished paintings in the show, the drawings will, we hope, also illuminate Van Dyck's way of working on a portrait. The high point of the show, at least in my view, is the group of drawings and a few oil sketches that are on view in the galleries downstairs, where we brought together the largest number ever of works related to the print series known since the 18th century as the iconography, or more correctly in French, the iconographie. Although much about its genesis and production remains unclear, Van Dyck must have started thinking about the series on his return from Italy in 1627-1628, and by 1632, a first edition had come out, which one of the sitters, Constantin Huygens, seen here, referred to as the Book of Famous Men by Anton van Dyck. We today know of no copy of this elusive edition, and it is clear that the series kept growing with portraits of scholars, crowned heads, and other aristocrats, military men, artists, and collectors. Similar series of portraits of celebrities had been produced before in different media, in paintings, in medals, in illuminations and prints, but none became as comprehensive and influential as Van Dyck's. Early on in the project, at the end of the 1620s, I assume, Van Dyck seems to have had the intention of etching the initial states of the prince himself, as he did in the portrait at left of the still life painter Frans Snijders, on view also in the exhibition. He would then give the copper plate to a professional engraver who, with a tool called a burin, would bring the plate to the high finish and subtle tonal gradations of the states at right. The final states of these prints were the ones included in the iconography, and it is these widely distributed prints which established his influence on contemporaries and generations of portraitists to come, more than the painted portraits by Van Dyck in the homes of Flemish burghers, the palazzi of Italian princes and cardinals, and the town or country houses of his English sitters. From the example of the Snijders portraits, it is clear that at least in some cases, Van Dyck based the prints not on a drawing made from life, but on an intermediary work itself based on such a study. The Snijders print, which here appears again at right, and which he must have made in the years surrounding 1630 or the end of the 1620s, shows the sitter as he appears in the Frick's celebrated portrait, which dates from around 1620, meaning that the print represents Snijders 10 years younger than he actually was at the time the print was published. The question about the exact kind of life study that Van Dyck made for the portraits in his series comes up with other works related to it. Of the Antwerp humanist Caspar Gevaerts, for instance, the exhibition includes a chalk drawing from the Albertina and an oil sketch on panel lent by the Duke of Buccleuch here on the screen. Both are outstanding examples of Van Dyck's virtuoso handling of chalk and the brush, respectively, and they offer very lively portraits of the sitter. Taken on their own, one could be tempted to declare both of them to be made from life, with Gevaerts sitting before Van Dyck. It is clear, however, that Van Dyck must have based at least one of them on the other one, and it cannot even be excluded that the earlier version of the two is itself a replica of a lost life head study by Van Dyck. When carefully comparing the drawing and the sketch, as you now can in the gallery downstairs, the conclusion must be that the drawing came first. Among other things, there is a small correction in the drawing, a pentimento, in the position of Gevaerts' thumb, which was followed in the oil sketch. Moreover, the print in the iconography, here you see the three works together, faithfully follows the oil sketch. Look, for example, at the altered cloak and lace collar and the much broader shoulders. At the same time, it should be noted how accurately the features of Gevaerts are transferred from the drawing onto the oil sketch, and then again from the oil sketch onto the copper plate from which the print was pulled. Van Dyck and his printmakers certainly took great care to stay as close as possible to the prototype of Gevaerts' face, mindful of de Piel's maxim that the greatest perfection of a portrait is extreme likeness. In the case of Gevaert's portraits, I think it is likely that the drawing was made from life, even if the subtle detail and refinement of execution exceeds by far what I imagine a man can achieve with his hands while also having to look at a sitter in front of him, but then I can't draw at all. There is no doubt in my mind about this portrait, though, which depicts an Antwerp colleague of Van Dyck, another Antwerp colleague of Van Dyck, Sebastian Franks, and which is lent by the British Museum. It must have been made from life. The lack of finish of his costume and pose is of the same kind one observes in many of the portrait drawings, for instance, Ingres made from life, such as the one of his friend Jean-Joseph Fournier, also at the Metropolitan. And you see again the very detailed head, which must have been the start of the drawing, and the much more summarily indicated, quickly, swiftly drawn costume. Even more clearly done from life is this portrait by Van Dyck in Stockholm, not included in the show, which I believe is a portrait, and maybe even the best, certainly most lively portrait, of the Dutch stadtholder Frederick Henry, one of Van Dyck's most dedicated early patrons. Drawn with the sash of a military commander, Frederick Henry may not have been available to Van Dyck for a long sitting, and Van Dyck knew he had to concentrate on capturing the head, sketching his bust only in the barest of outlines and leaving that part of the portrait to be worked out at a later stage. In the case of the Stockholm drawing, Van Dyck never seems to have developed the portrait any further, but he did in the case of this drawing of a Spanish general, Manuel Frocas, from the Duke of Chatsworth's collection. Again, the formidable head was drawn very carefully with chalk, while the costume and pose were worked out later, with a change of dress in between. Frocas's civil clothes in the drawing have become a nice piece of armor, including a baton in the oil sketch, which was, again, closely followed in the related print. However, I feel some of Van Dyck's most appealing and famous drawings for the iconography cannot be considered to be made from life. This concerns, for instance, these two portraits, so similar and at the same time so different from the Stedel in Frankfurt and from the British Museum. The one at left, one of my favorites, is a portrait of Hendrik van Steenwijk, a painter of church interiors in Antwerp, while the one at right represents Van Dyck's Italian colleague in London, Orazio Gentileschi. Although the two drawings contain all the liveliness of Van Dyck's best portraits, I find it hard to believe that even an exceptional gifted artist could have attained in a sitting from life the perfection seen in their faces, their costumes, and their theatrical poses. I consider them to be the final result of a much longer process, which started with a now lost sketch drawn from life. Here at left is another example of these fully worked out drawings related to a print, the famous portrait from Chatsworth of the English architect and designer Inigo Jones. Van Dyck's drawings and the oil sketches for the iconography may contain the most beautiful portraits of the exhibition, but as I already remarked in connection with Gossard's portrait, again here at right, their finish and completeness is in a way less a function of their being portraits than of the function of their being print models, which had to offer precise, very precise guidance for the printmakers working with Van Dyck. The drawings for the iconography are a discrete section of Van Dyck's surviving portrait drawings, and they tell us very little, if anything at all, about his usual method of preparing a painted portrait. Indeed, the impetus for this show was in a way the puzzling realization that Van Dyck, the quintessential portrait painter, left us almost no head studies for his paintings, the kind of drawings that artists or would-be artists in Central Park or on the Ponte Vecchio or on the Place du Tertre seen here make for tourists. In the hands of a real genius and a real artist of genius, like some of those by whom I've shown you head studies before, such drawings could look like this. At left is again the drawing in London by Peter Paul Rubens of his first wife, Isabella Brandt. At right, an attractive drawing from the Lucht collection by a Flemish contemporary, Jan Cossiers, who here drew one of his sons, Jan Frans. Cossiers' drawing was made in 1658, so after the death of Van Dyck, but Van Dyck was certainly aware of the tradition of detailed head studies, if only because he knew those by Rubens. In fact, Van Dyck appears to have used Rubens' drawing of Brandt as the model for a painting now in Washington and here at right, possibly because Brandt had died by the time Van Dyck worked on the portrait. The loving detail of Rubens' study is the Baroque equivalent of the studies by Van Eyck and Bonsignori, which we discussed before, and it certainly contained enough precise information about Brandt's appearance for Van Dyck to base his painting on. However, judging by the drawings that survive, Van Dyck seems not to have followed Rubens' example of making himself such heads on paper. The example he did follow are the kinds of drawings Rubens also made, including on the verso of the head study of Isabella Brandt, the drawing at right on the screen. A quick sketch in red and black chalk, it seems to be a first idea for what would become a self-portrait of Rubens with his second wife, Hélène Fourment, and one of their children. The painting is, again, one of the masterpieces from the Weitzman collection at the Metropolitan. When looking at what I believe is Van Dyck's earliest preserved drawing, the sheets at right from the National Gallery of Art, we see certain similarities between Rubens' work and Van Dyck's, especially in the use of red and black chalk, and also in a certain coarseness, a certain lack of an attempt to make a beautiful drawing. The Washington drawing, which has occasionally been doubted as work by Van Dyck, is in fact very obviously a preparatory sketch for a painting of an Antwerp merchant in the Museum of Antwerp today. In most of Van Dyck's drawings related to painted portraits, the heads are in fact only summarily indicated, as in the drawing from London at left, or almost not drawn at all, as in the sketch for the large portrait of Henrietta Maria at right from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Both sheets are in the exhibition. The purpose of these drawings is clearly not capturing a sitter's likeness, but studying the costume and the pose, which in most portraits is almost the same as the composition. Such drawings must have been very swiftly executed and often look quite rough. An early source describes them as, quote, figures and postures all in sudden lines as angles, with black chalk and heightened with white chalk. Even in drawings that depict the head in a much more detailed way, like this study from the Lucht collection, it is highly doubtful that Van Dyck could have made the related painting in London, which you see here at right, without any additional head study. In this detail of the painting, which you can see in the original on the other side of the wall behind me, but you can see that the face contains considerably more detail than the chalk study, and there must have been at least one other moment when Van Dyck had the sitter before him and could study his features. The only surviving drawing by Van Dyck that is detailed and large, is a detailed and large head study, is this drawing from Amsterdam, also in the show, one of the great works in the downstairs galleries. In the precision and the quivering, sometimes almost hesitating lines in the face, we can feel that Van Dyck was directing his hand while sharply observing the king's face. There may be a good reason why the only surviving drawing of this type by Van Dyck is a study of his royal patron, although Charles liked to call himself a friend of the painter. As the head of one of Europe's most powerful states, his availability for sittings must have been limited, and Van Dyck may have realized that a chalk study on paper would be the quickest way to record the king's likeness. With any oeuvre that survives in as fragmentary a state as Van Dyck's drawings, one should be cautious in reaching conclusions, and it is probable, even if the artist was a very, very methodical one, and he would always have allowed himself exceptions in the way he worked. But with an artist as popular and productive as Van Dyck, it is also evident that he must have developed a highly efficient and streamlined way of working, just as Rubens did, in order to satisfy the international demand for paintings from his studio. It is this exhibition's thesis that Van Dyck, when working on a painted portrait, preferred to capture a sitter's likeness directly on canvas in oil in a style that is at the same time economical and sufficiently detailed. So in oil, on canvas instead of on paper. If very few of these head studies survive, it is, we think, because they were mostly made on the canvas destined for the finished portrait and were later covered by the finishing layers of the canvas. The theory seems confirmed by little more than a handful of surviving head studies in oil on canvas, of which 3 can be seen in this exhibition. The most endearing one, for sure, is this small sketch from Edinburgh, depicting 2 of the children of Charles I. The studies are related to a much larger portrait of 5 of the king's children, and it was maybe because of the size of the final canvas and maybe because of the young age of the sitters who would not have been very patient that Van Dyck considered a separate oil sketch the way to go. He also made separate head studies for 2 of the largest commissions he ever received, group portraits of members of the Brussels Town Council, painted for the town hall and sadly destroyed already at the end of the 17th century. Even the smallest of these 2 group portraits must have been bigger than anything else Van Dyck painted, and making his head studies from nature directly on that enormous canvas may have been simply too complicated. Instead, Van Dyck produced head studies on canvases of much more manageable size, of which these 2, not in the exhibition, are at the Ashmolean Museum, while these 2, both in private collections, are in the show. They are clearly painted in a minimum of time, but at the same time contain all the information about the sitter's effigy Van Dyck would have required for the finished work. Our only idea of the finished composition is based on this oil sketch, also on view downstairs, from the École des Beaux-Arts, and at least 3 of the heads can be easily recognized in the composition, which I may point out if you look at this head, that's very clearly the man seen here at left. Once Van Dyck had made head studies of all the sitters, he and his assistants could go at work on the large canvas and could copy the studies made from life onto the final canvas. I would not want to claim that Van Dyck was the only or even the first artist who worked in this efficient manner. A number of his English successors, for instance, including Thomas Gainsborough and Joshua Reynolds, seem to have worked in a very similar way. In fact, it seems clear that both these artists closely studied and sometimes even owned and collected drawings and paintings by Van Dyck, and they seem to have fashioned their working method after their Flemish model. The drawing on the screen is a portrait study by Gainsborough, also a recent acquisition by the Metropolitan Museum, which, like most of Van Dyck's studies, focuses mainly on the pose and the costume of the sitter, probably a famous actress at the time. Gainsborough would have probably worked on the heads directly on the final canvas. At least no or very few detailed head studies by Gainsborough survive, as is the case with Van Dyck. But Van Dyck himself may have been inspired to work in this way by 16th century predecessors, some of which he discovered in the use of oil the possibility to paint in a less detailed, much looser and more lively manner than was possible in tempera, the technique preferred by or used by many earlier or by most earlier painters. Although certain Netherlandish artists, such as Frans Floris, introduced this style in the north, it would have been especially Venetian artists in whose work Van Dyck found a suitable model. Portrait studies by artists like Paolo Veronese can be compared in almost all of its features with those made by Van Dyck several decades later. Here is an example by Veronese. The influence of the more general rendition of a face's detail, the glowing colors and soft contours of Venetian portraiture can already be detected in Van Dyck's first known work and the first painting in the exhibition's catalogue. This work in Brussels dated 1613, which he made when he was 14 years old. In some of the most distinguished collections in Antwerp, including those of his teachers Hendrik van Baarle and Peter Paul Rubens, Van Dyck could have seen and studied a number of Italian, including Venetian paintings. They must have impressed the boy even before he was able to go to Italy himself in 1621, when he placed himself even more squarely in the tradition of Italian portraitists, above all in the lineage of Titian. Contemporaries already remarked on this connection, and writing in 1672, Gian Pietro Bellori said that Van Dyck had justly acquired the greatest name that any painter had ever merited since Titian. With the benefit of seeing together a substantial number of Van Dyck's works in different media related to portraits, the visitor to the exhibition will hopefully be able to convince himself that Van Dyck's excellence as a portraitist was not limited to his paintings, but equally apparent in his prints, both in their etched and their engraved states, in his rare oil sketches, and not in the last place, in his beautiful drawings. From the refined to the coarse, here 2 drawings in the show, one related to the iconography and one related to a painting in Wilton House in England. From the graphic to the painterly, again 2 works in the show, the famous etched state of his self-portrait and a remarkable painting on view for the first time in New York, and I think in any big museum, on loan from the Speed Museum in Louisville. From the informal to the formal, it writes a portrait of William and Mary, one of the daughters of Charles I. And from the simple to the fabulously sumptuous, these works by Van Dyck remind us that he is indeed one of the very great. Thank you.